Hi there, folks, and welcome once again to my library. This time you're going to see behind me the green drawing room. This is at Windsor. If I lean too far out of the screen, you get to see my lovely green cloth behind me instead of this. The reason I selected this today was because so many of the kinds of negotiations that we're going to be dealing with today are going to be played out in places like this. The 19th century did diplomacy in drawing rooms of great houses. And so it's very fitting that we kind of look at this as we look at the diplomatic maneuvers that will draw us into World War One. Now, what you see here is a bit of a map that I'll talk about in a moment that has to do with the alliance system put together by this gentleman here. This is Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck is the very first chancellor of Germany, a united Germany, and here he is playing chess with the Pope over various territories that they both want. And Bismarck was probably one of the consummate chess players in world history, and particularly when it came to diplomacy and how to develop one's nation. Now, the key in all of this is going to be the question of nationalism. Now, all of this business about nationalism and alliances is the lead up into World War One. Now, we call it the First World War, but the First World War doesn't get that name until after we have a Second World War in the 20th century. In its own time, it was called the Great War. It was called the War to End All Wars. It was called the War to Make the World Safe to Democracy. It was called the European War. Lots of different things it was called. It wasn't called the First World War. Most of the time it was called the Great War, really until we get through the Second World War. Now, the spark that sets this off is in Sarajevo with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And this moment with the Archduke and Sarajevo is going to be part of what we call the powder keg of the Balkans. The Balkans was notorious for its instability. We even have a word called balkanization. It means, in fact, the repeated fracturing and reforming of a territory. That geographers still use this term. And what you see over here in this particular cartoon, and I love political cartoons of the late 19th and early 20th century. They're fabulous. Is all of the European leaders sitting on a pot that's about to boil over, and on the pot is called the Balkan Troubles. They've reached a boiling point, and nobody quite knows when it's going to go over. And part of the problem with the Balkans is the ones who used to be in charge of the area are the Ottomans, and the Ottomans are now called the sick man of Europe. This is a country that is being eaten away by its neighbors. Parts of the empire have been chipped away by Britain, by France, by Russia, by Austria, by Greece, which declared its independence in 1823. So it's just not in a good position. And the assassination of the Archduke occurs here in Sarajevo in June of 1914. But that's the catalyst. That's the spark that sets things aflame. And there were other sparks that had not caught. So the reality is the spark is not a cause. There were other causes. And many thought that war was not inevitable. There were lots of peace societies, advocates for peace, conferences about peace in The Hague, in the Netherlands. There were lots of these different kinds of things going on. And with so many advocates for peace, most people thought, we're done with war. We're going to negotiate our way out of this. After all, we're very elegant and civilized folk who live in houses like the one you see behind me, and we are progressing, and therefore we won't need the avenue of war anymore. Now, not everybody believed this. Norman Angell, who writes a book in 1910 called The Great Illusion, talks about how Europe is speeding very, very fast towards war. And we'll see that in other ways with alliance systems and with the belligerence of the language of the era. But there were other factors that made people think that war was not very likely. And part of that had to do with Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria of Great Britain, second longest reigning monarch, had 9 children. Those children married abroad. And 39 separate royal houses in Europe were tied to Victoria's heirs directly. What you see on this map are some of the most significant of those royal houses: Romania, Greece, Spain, Norway, Russia, and of course the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. In fact, I didn't bring this picture with me this time, but there's this grand picture of Kaiser Wilhelm II, whom you see here, plus Alexandra's husband, Nicholas II of Russia, and George VI of, George V of England. And the 3 of them look like they could be triplets. They look so very, very close together, and that's something that's very key to keep in mind. But despite all of that and all of the factors that could lead to peace, the balance of power was off. And with the balance of power off, war was growing ever closer. So how does the balance of power problem occur? Well, the simple answer is nationalism. And so that despite all of the things that they'll do in the wake of Napoleon to try and create peaceful Europe and measures of peace, nationalism is going to overturn all that they had tried. So let's go take a little bit of nationalism. Nationalism has a couple of different origin points, some theoretical, some in terms of events, and some that are going to be more cultural. You're hearing the Marseillaise again. The Marseillaise, the national anthem of France, is typical of kind of the symbols of fraternity, the symbols of nationalism that came out. Now, the French Revolution, as I mentioned last time, had a motto that had 3 parts: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And fraternity is the piece that's going to be the key one for the rise and fall of nationalism. This brotherhood of all Frenchmen. And in fact, it's that kind of concept that's going to lend itself to the fall of Napoleon eventually. Now, there was, in fact, going to be a much theory about this as well. And most of the theory is going to come from Johann von Herder. Now, von Herder was one of many philosophers coming out of Germany in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. But unlike so many, he is not, in fact, an Enlightenment philosopher. He's very much going to belong to the next phase, which is the Romantics. And in his political philosophy, he's going to talk about that each nation is a people, not a country. Okay. Now we use the words nation, country, and state. Those 3 we use interchangeably. Okay. Herder says no. He says a state is a political entity. He says a nation is a people, culture and heritage and a language that's all unique to them. And each nation, he says, has a unique spirit, or a Volksgeist, to use the German here. The Volksgeist was a unique spirit, something that was different for each country. I shared on the Facebook page the Queen's speech concerning the current pandemic, and she talks about the spirit of the British people. And that's a really fascinating idea, and it's something that's part of the discussion that surrounds nationalism. And born out of this concept that each nation, each group is unique, grows this idea of a nation state, that each group, each national group, ought to have its own state, and thereby brings in lots and lots of warfare over this particular idea. Because the reality was that much of Europe was not nation states where you had one language, culture group per political entity. Okay, that's not how it worked. It's not how the United States works now. And quite frankly, if you go look at France now, it doesn't work that way there either. Um, and it certainly didn't work in places like Russia or the Austro-Hungarians or the Ottomans. In fact, many of these rulers, like Metternich, who I talked about in the question of ideologies, saw nationalism as particularly dangerous and could lead to the undoing of their governments and empires. And he wasn't wrong, and neither were those others who were concerned, because in Austria and Russia and the Ottoman empires, this is a particularly dangerous sort of thing. I'm going to show you the map real quick again. And you can see this looks very different than the map that you're learning for your map test for the post-war period, because this group isn't there. This isn't there. This isn't there. There's lots of little countries in here. Why? Because there were lots and lots and lots of different nation groups, and they were not neatly grouped in any fashion, which made conceiving of a map even more difficult. Now, this ideology of nationalism will, in fact, spread other places besides these empires. It was very, very potent in the New World, certainly for places like Haiti and the United States eventually, and Colombia and Mexico and Peru and Chile and a host of all of these places. But also in Italia, in the Italian Peninsula and in the Germanic areas, because they didn't have a United State. And the unification of those states is, like I said, that's in the other lecture that I'm not going to talk about today. But it also spreads to places like Africa and Asia and results in decolonization movements in the latter half of the 20th century. Now, there were lots of different manifestations of nationalism. There was the cultural nationalism of the Romantics. We want to identify what this individual Volksgeist is and thereby celebrate it. And it comes out in lots of different ways. It comes out in the writings of these guys right here. This is the Brothers Grimm. They write and collect all the folk tales of Germany. Snow White and Rumpelstiltskin and a host of others. It also came out in these groups, these nationalistic groups that tried to move their particular areas more towards unification in Germany, in Italy. But you also got young or youth liberal movements talking about nationalism in France and in England as well. The failed revolutions of 1848 largely are associated with these various groups. And you can see in 1820 and 1830, we get a lot of those different. The reason that you're hearing a piece of our national anthem there is by the 1850s, established governments in the United States, France, Britain, Russia, Spain, and eventually Germany see in nationalism a tool that they can use. They use it to create ceremonies and establish anthems and help it to foster support for expansionist policies. These national anthems and ceremonies, many of them didn't have roots that went back century upon century. They were created as part of the nationalism of the later 19th century. Sometimes this nationalism resulted in warfare in the 19th century. Things like the Russo-Turkish War of 1878, which is going to coin a term, jingoism, which means extreme nationalism, belligerent nationalism. Not just, I like my country, but my country is the best and must conquer all of you. That's belligerent nationalism. And the term jingoism comes from a song that's sung in the music halls of England. And the song's lyrics went something like this. We don't want to go to war, but by jingo if we do. We've got the men, we've got the guns, we've got the money too. And the Russians shall not have Constantinople. And the refrain was that. And the Russians shall not have Constantinople. The Russians shall not have Constantinople. This is what they would sing, okay? And for entertainment, this is obviously creating an extreme nationalistic situation. But it wasn't just, my nationalism wasn't just about the governments using it to motivate their people to go to war. Certainly they're going to do that. But it's also going to be about these minority groups that want their own nation state. And how do I get mine? Well, I have to rebel against an established government in Austria, in Spain, and wherever to create my own government. And so we start to see these minority groups. Now, this is the kind of terrorist violence, the kind of nationalism that we're more used to in a lot of ways. Now, by 1871, Europe the map had changed. We've had the unification of two significant countries, okay? Germany, which has now become the German Empire. It had been Prussia centered over here in the east, but now they have this vast territory that stretches all the way over here to the French border, much to the annoyance of the French. But you also have Italy down here. Italy, which is brand new, and it's also feeling its way through national maneuvers and international diplomacy. And often they're more interested in what they can get territorially than anything else. They still want some territory from Austria. You'll notice this little indentation there, which is not exactly how the border of Italy looks now. And part of that's because of some decisions they're going to make. You're also going to have Russia over here, Great Britain and Norway and France and Spain. But Germany has a significant problem in terms of its position. Germany has an ongoing foe in France, right there. And Bismarck, the great chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, has a nightmare scenario. His nightmare scenario is that Germany could, in fact, be surrounded on all sides by enemies. She's landlocked. That means she has a very long border. And it's very, very possible that the British, the French, the Italians, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Russians could all decide to go to war against Germany all at once. That's the sort of thing that had Bismarck waking up in the middle of the night in cold sweats. This sort of thing. So, how does one combat this? How does one get around this? What does one do? Well, Bismarck, being the consummate chess player that he is going to play chess. And more than that, he's going to make alliances as part of the game of diplomacy. So how do you stop this from happening? Well, his answer is that you need to play this game of diplomacy very, very well. The first thing is you need some principles. He's going to build a house of cards. And he's going to have 3 principles that are going to be how he structures this system around to keep Germany safe and to keep Germany from facing this. Now, if you haven't printed out your house of cards handout, I recommend you pause right now and go print it, because you're going to want it for the next couple of slides as we talk about how this works. Now, there are 3 strategic principles. I'm assuming now that you're back from having printed, or that it's printing while we're talking, or something of those natures. There are 3 strategic principles that Bismarck is going to follow in the creation of an alliance system to try and keep his nightmare scenario from happening, from Germany having to fight a 2-front war. First one, keep France isolated. France can have no friends, none, not even frenemies. They cannot have any. Okay. Second, we need reliable allies, people who will show up for us. That's a little trickier to come by. And we need to not tick off the British. Okay, why do we need to not tick off the British? Because the British have the Navy, and the British hold this area and much of the world. They have the world's largest Navy at this point. And not ticking off the British is going to ensure that the British don't come into this scenario, okay? Quite frankly, Bismarck doesn't hold out a lot of hope of them being an ally of Germany. But if we can just get them to stay out of continental warfare, which they don't really want to be involved in anyhow, it'll work. So, France, no friends. Us, Germany, we need friends. And one of them needs to be Great Britain. Okay, so let's go see how he creates his house of cards. Now, on your handout, you should have a couple of boxes with little symbols for hearts for cards in them. And that's what we're going to be using here as we go through. Now, Bismarck's House of Cards is a series of alliances that he's going and steps of diplomatic maneuvering that he's going to use to increase the profile of Germany and to make Germany seen as critical amongst the family of nations and as a peacemaker, not a warmonger, but a peacemaker. Because Bismarck's fought a lot of wars in his time. Now the wars are done. He's got Germany unified. He needs to keep Germany safe by fostering peace. First thing, well, he tries to secure allies for himself by creating the Three Emperors League in 1873. The Three Emperors League, the three emperors are the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm I, the Tsar of Russia, and the Austrian Emperor. There's only one problem. Austria and Russia don't like each other, okay? And they have competing interests in the Balkans, that powder keg area. The Russians want to support their little Slavic brothers in a term called Pan-Slavism, which means all of those who speak Slavic languages are related and therefore should get along and be one giant group, okay? And the Russians see themselves as the big brother protector. Austria wants those territories for themselves. So it creates serious issues. And the league fails. Okay, so if you want to write failed over top of it, because it fails. Then we also have, well, that one didn't work. So he creates another one. He creates the dual alliance, an alliance with Austria-Hungary, to try and create a bond with Austria. After all, Austrians spoke German. They were German. Been part of the same empire for centuries before the Holy Roman Empire died. So therefore, my music is causing us issues, so I'm going to stop because it's causing the video to have some issues. So he creates the dual alliance. Now, the dual alliance, you can put a star by because this one does work. He creates this in 1879. Now, his third card is not an alliance, but it's a principle. While everybody else in Europe is running around getting colonies in Africa and in Asia, Bismarck's going to say no. He's going to say no, we are not going to have, they're going to wind up with like a couple of ports here and there in China, but that's it. And the reason being is Bismarck deliberately doesn't do this. And he doesn't do this because he's going to put him in direct competition with Britain. The kind of direct competition that France is already in. And France's competition with Great Britain has, in fact, caused lots and lots of international incidents between the two countries. And that's why he says no colonies. Second piece, not going to build a navy. You can have a small fleet that will defend your coastline, but he's not building big, giant battleships and pouring lots of money into developing a navy. Why? Because if he does, he's going to tick off the British. And the British are going to see him as a threat, and that's what he doesn't want. He can't quite get over this whole business of the Three Emperors League. Partly because, well, he really wants to secure the back door, the eastern door. because the eastern flank is held by Russia. Now, he's got his southern flank secured with Austria, and Austria is going to be a fairly solid ally, and nobody's going to be coming in that way. He needs to secure the Russian border so he doesn't have to fight a two-front war, because he assumes that he's going to have to fight France. He's not wrong, but he assumes he's going to have to fight France. So therefore, I need something over here to hold this border. So he tries the Three Emperors League again. And the exact same problems that caused it to fail in 1873 are what caused it to fail within a year again. Russia and Austria have competing interests. It's that simple. And therefore, they cannot ally with one another because they keep stepping on each other's toes. So he adds another guy to his alliance with Austria. He adds in the Italians. Now, this is risky because the Italians and the Austrians also have similar interests. But it's not quite as big because Italy is a little younger in this as a modern state. So he gets away with it a little bit longer. But it's a little shaky. Italy is still not the greatest ally. So he still needs to secure that back door, that Russian flank. So in 1887, he signs a reinsurance treaty with Russia. Now, this treaty with Russia does not make an alliance. Doesn't do that at all. What does it do? Well, it says that we agree not to attack each other for 10 years. Now, that means if Russia gets into it with Austria, I'm not obligated as Germany to come in and try and save the day. And you're not obligated to go to war with me if there's another issue here, okay? So we're just not going to go to war for 10 years. For 10 years. And there was an option to renew. So, we could renew it a little bit later on. And so he's secured his back door. And he's going to do a couple of other things. He's going to host the Berlin Conference to make certain Berlin is part of this peace process in 1884. But also in 1887, he fosters peace between Italy, Austria, and Britain. And he hosts a conference. He's not a signatory to this agreement, but Germany, not Switzerland, is going to be the place where all these peace treaties are taking place in drawing rooms, because he's trying to foster peace between his allies. Because if Italy and Austria and Britain don't have any outlying problems in the Mediterranean, then they're less likely to start a war and cause problems for him. So it's got it's secured. It looks good. Because the one that's not anywhere on this chart is France. And so he's got something that looks like this. Okay, let me put my picture away for a moment. And then what you see here is he's got his alliance ring that sort of surrounds France. And France has access to its colonies, but France doesn't have the solid kind of alliance system that Germany does. He's got this Three Emperors League. He's got his other pieces here that are going to make things so that he can rest easy about France and not having to go fight a two-front war. But something happens. And that something is the very problem that we always seem to have with monarchy. You can't control who the heir is. And in this case, the heir was this gentleman here. The new Kaiser is a fellow by the name of Wilhelm II, William II in English, who rules from 1888 until 1918. So he takes the throne, becomes king, the year that his father dies, which is only a year after Bismarck's gotten all of his pieces in place to hold up this protective net, this house of cards that surrounds Germany. But the trouble is that Wilhelm II sees himself as very much a Prussian. He's very proud of the Prussian military history. He has great respect for Frederick the Great and all of Frederick's great conquests against other people, and he's very much gung ho Prussian military, German military. And he sees Germany needing to conquer more territory. And because he sees that, he doesn't always like all of Bismarck's ideas. And his attitude reminds me very, very clearly of Rehoboam. Rehoboam was, if you remember, Solomon's son. And in 1 Kings 12, Rehoboam is given advice by his father's counselors and by his own people of his own age. And his father's counselors tell him to lessen the taxes on the people. Because the temple's built, the palace is built, you need to lessen the taxes and ease the burden on them. And he doesn't listen. He rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. And of course, as a result, as God had already said, he loses 10 out of 12 tribes. William II is a lot like Rehoboam. He doesn't listen to sound advice. And he has an argument with his chancellor, the same man who created a unified Germany, Bismarck. This particular cartoon was published in the British papers. It's called Dropping the Pilot. In other words, he's firing the guy who created modern Germany, created the safety net to keep, in fact, Germany safe, and he's going to get rid of it. Bismarck is dismissed as chancellor within 2 years. And almost immediately, the House of Cards, the network designed to keep Germany safe, the Kaiser will just completely dismantle. Okay, second set of handouts with all of the cards on them. First card. In 1890, he cancels the reinsurance treaty with Russia. Now, the trouble is that when you cancel the agreement that you had not to attack somebody, they believe you're going to attack them, strangely enough. Well, quite frankly, Kaiser Wilhelm II felt that this whole treaty was dishonest. Of course we want land from Russia. And Bismarck's going, you're such an idiot. Of course you want land from Russia, but you don't go telling them you want land from Russia. But, it's dishonest. We have to do this. He's not dishonest. He's not just honest. He's belligerent is his problem. So, what happens? The Russians, rightly believing that the Germans are about to attack them, go hunting for an ally. The very thing that Bismarck has been trying to avoid. Wilhelm II gives me a headache. I'm sure he gave Bismarck one. I know he gave Bismarck many. Wilhelm II is now faced with a Franco-Russian military convention. It means that they have a direct military alliance. That if you attack one, you attack the other. It's that simple. The very thing that the first principle of Bismarck's foreign policy was not to have this kind of alliance. And then the Kaiser reads a book. The book he reads is by Alfred Thayer Mahan, Mahan. It's called The Influence of Sea Power on History. And the argument of the book is that no country has ever become to greatness without a navy. And therefore, the Kaiser believes we need a navy. Same reason that Teddy Roosevelt's going to believe that we need a navy. And as a result, he starts to build a navy. Well, building a navy is going to lead you in direct competition with your grandmother, Queen Victoria, who fusses at him. And for the next 14 years, we're going to have a race to see who can build the biggest ship. The British will eventually build what is known as the Dreadnought class of battleships. It's called the Dreadnought because it could go anywhere and dread nothing, fear nothing. Okay, it's the fear nothing class. In a moment that I think would have just appalled Bismarck, the Kaiser is going to commission the largest battleship afloat. He's going to call it the Bismarck. I think Bismarck rolled over in his grave. It's the very thing he told him not to do. But Kaiser Wilhelm doesn't listen very well to many people. Great Britain, with a naval race in front of her, decides that for the first time in a century, they might need an ally. And in fact, hi guys. Sometimes when you extemporize on a point, you find of yourself making an error. I just double checked something. The Bismarck is actually built under Nazi Germany, not by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Quite frankly, it still is something that Bismarck would have been appalled by, this kind of naval race. But it does put Britain in a really tight place. She's got a naval race with a country that's her near neighbor, and she doesn't like that. And so she finds herself hunting for the first time in the century for an alliance. Now, the reality is she doesn't really want to get tied to the continent because that means more wars, but she finds an ally who is much like her in a lot of ways. An island country, building a naval empire, and so she signs on a military alliance with Japan. This is something to put a star by. That Japan is actually going to be on the side of the alliance, the Allies in World War I, opposite to Germany. She will switch sides for the Second World War, as we'll see. The sixth card in this thing is what is known as the Entente Cordiale in 1904. What happens is, once again, in a drawing room like the one you see behind me, the British and the French decide, Germany's becoming a bit of an issue. We're going to sit down, and we're going to talk, and we're going to solve all of the outlying problems. And Britain had a lot of clashes with France in the process of the two of them building empires. And so in 1904, they're not establishing an alliance. They're not committed technically to defending the island. They sit down and, we're no longer arguing with one another. We've agreed to a truce. We've settled this issue and settled that issue. All right, we're good. It's just a friendly agreement. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II does not take this seriously at all because it doesn't seem to have the kind of hard core to it that his alliance with Austria does, or even the French and Russian alliance does. But what this doesn't tell you, this piece of paper, is that the British military and the French military began making plans for war together and holding joint military exercises, something they'd never done before. And this is an indication that the relationship is growing much closer between the British and the French than it's ever been before. And then 3 years later, the English take another step. Under Edward the Seventh, the English make an alliance with Russia, a military convention. And quite frankly, at this point, Kaiser decides that his uncle Edward, who's the king of Great Britain, hates him and is in a conspiracy against him. He's a little bit paranoid. But problem is he's kind of out to get everybody else, and they sort of recognize it. So we have an alliance between the English and the Japanese, an alliance between the English and the Russians, and a friendly agreement over here between the English and the French. This is getting rather dangerous. And then we have the Daily Telegraph affair. Now, in your textbook, go read the text of this interview that Kaiser Wilhelm II gives to a British newspaper and insults everybody. He insults the Americans, he insults the British, he insults the Russians, the French, the Italians, who are his allies. He's gifted. In one interview, he practically insults about 7 countries. He's gifted, just not in a good way. It's a talent to tick that many people off that quickly. We call it the Kaiser's personal diplomacy, is what historians refer to this as. That his personal diplomacy was boorish, belligerent, and quite frankly, offensive. And not offensive and I'm going to launch an attack at you, but just insulting. And instead of making friends and making alliances, he ticks people off and makes them quite frankly, much more likely to go to war with him. Within the matter of a decade, it's 2 decades. 2 decades, he's killed the alliance system of Bismarck. And more than that, the nightmare has come true. Now, Germany has an ally in Austria and in Italy. There's the Triple Alliance in green. And the Triple Entente, which includes Russia, Britain, and France. Germany's now surrounded on all sides. The nightmare has come true. This is precisely what Bismarck didn't want. Now, these sides don't completely align with what's going to be the sides in the First World War, but they're awful close. The only one that switches is Italy. And Germany is surrounded. The only place she has allies is to the south. Now, what that's going to mean is that all of these countries who now have all these alliances and who are all talking about peace and having peace conferences are also going to be planning for war. In fact, it's odd. World War I is incredibly well planned. It's just that no battle plan survives the first 5 minutes of contact with the enemy. And all of the planners of World War I seem to have forgotten this very thing. Something they should have known. But in their defense, World War I was unlike a war that they'd really seen. The only real analogy to this war was not the Franco-Prussian War, or it was Crimea and the American Civil War and the kind of slogfest that it was. This is not something they're prepared for. They are considering war to be like the really short wars of the rest of the 19th century, limited wars. But that's not what they're going to get. But they do come up with some plans. The German plan is called the Schlieffen Plan, after von Schlieffen, who's a military advisor, who comes up with it. It's a plan for how to fight a two-front war. Because, well, now with Kaiser's diplomacy, that's what we're going to have because France and Russia have an alliance and they're on either side of us and we're in the middle. So we have to figure out how to fight them. So what do we do? Well, this is the plan. Okay, now I know this is in German, but this is kind of close to the original plans. The idea is here is Deutschland. This is the fatherland. This is Germany. German plan is 1, you have to attack France first. Okay, you can't attack Russia first. And the idea is that France would mobilize faster, Russia would take a long time. So we're going to fight Russia. We're going to fight France first. So we attack France. We have to attack France through Belgium and Luxembourg, which are both neutral, which is a really bad plan because that means that they're going to have to come in there. But Germany's plotting that they won't really care. And so you're going to come in and you're going to have your line and you're going to have your line go all the way to the sea. And it's going to swing around and come behind Paris and capture it. And we're going to be done with France inside 6 weeks. Okay, so 1, attack France first. 2, make certain that Paris falls inside 6 weeks. A 6-week time frame. Okay. Then you can shift all of these troops over here and fight the Russians. That's part 3. Now, you're just going to have to fight the Russians. But that's the plan. It's a pretty straightforward plan. It's the same plan that they'll use in World War I and in World War II. In World War I, it does not work. In World War II, it does. Okay. Now, the French are also going to have a plan. And you can see here, this is the Germans. They've got a plan for where every one is supposed to be, every troop is supposed to be, and they're supposed to, this group here is supposed to go over here and is supposed to be all the way to the sea and then swing around and flank behind Paris to catch it very quickly. The French plan is called Plan 17. The French plan had an idea of what the Germans were planning. It was something they knew. And so they began to come up with a plan that involved defensive fortifications through this area. But their plan also called for the finishing out of their defensive line to be 6 legions, six troops coming, 6 regiments. That's the word I want. 6 regiments coming from, in fact, Britain, and that it's not regiments, it's divisions, finishing out the French line. Okay. That's the idea. Now, nobody plans for this. Nobody plans to be here. This is the war they're going to get, fighting in trenches filled with mud and water and urine and blood. This is not the war they planned for, but it is the war they're going to get. Well, what about the Russians? Well, the Russians are also going to have a plan. The Russian plan is also rather sad. The Russian plan was not really much of a plan in some ways. The major problem is that Russia was not as industrialized as many of the other countries of the West, and that's part of her issue. She does not have the war materiel that smaller countries. Russia's still huge, just doesn't mean she has all the war material that everybody else in the West does. And the Russian plan said that you had to mobilize your entire border all at once. That you couldn't just go to war with Austria. You had to go to war with both Austria and Germany all at the same time, and you had to mobilize all of your troops to go along the whole border all at the same time. That was the idea. Now, that's not true. That's lockstep military thinking, but that's what they think, okay? And when we're talking about causes of the war, one of the causes is all the alliances and the Kaiser's diplomacy. But it's also this, where we've decided this is how we're going to fight the war. We've had our war game. This is what we're going to do, and that's it. Never mind that there are different circumstances. And of course there are circumstances when you don't need to mobilize the full border, but don't tell the Russians this. And of course they also have a technology problem. And the bigger problem is a lack of railroads in some places, though they have a lot more than they did when they fought in the Crimean War in the 1850s. But they also don't have enough rifles. And according to many sources, the first rank of Russia's troops was fully armed. The second rank within the formations was not fully outfitted with the gear and the rifles that they needed. And the third line didn't have much at all. And the plan was for the first rank of your army to shoot the other guys, and therefore the guys behind you to run through the lines and capture material from the other side, and we'll use that to fight the war. Now, one should always capture material from the other side when one is fighting a war, if at all possible, but that's not how you plan to equip your troops. Nobody wants to go to war unless you have enough guns. See the jingoism song at the beginning of this video. The planning for war, the planning for this through alliances with teams, despite the belief that war was unlikely, all of these pieces have set them up to fight. They have planned. They have chosen teams. You have a game. It sounds like you're ready to go to war, at least ready to play a game of kickball. You've chosen teams and you have a plan. This is what we do. And they talked about war like it was very, very likely, even though many didn't want to go to war. But as I mentioned, this is not a war like ones they've seen. This is going to be total war that consumes every resource and every household in a way like they have never seen before. It's the kind of war that we're a lot more familiar with. It's the kind of war they had not even an imagination of. And we'll talk about how they get into that war on the next video.